What if Godzilla was teleported to the Monster Hunter universe? Well, this would be quite fun. Now, it's easy to say that if Godzilla teleported to the Monster Hunter universe, then everybody else's goose would be cooked, and by everybody else we mean all the other monsters. But we fail to remember that there are monsters out there that can defeat Godzilla. I mean, he was struggling just to fight those two Mutos, and he was struggling against Ghidorah, even though he did get the upper hand more times than Ghidorah had the upper hand with him. But Ghidorah flew into the freaking sky and dropped Godzilla. If it weren't for the humans and Mothra helping him, Godzilla would have died. Or at least he would have been severely injured by Ghidorah. He would have lost that fight. One thing for sure right off the bat that legendary Godzilla would have working for him is his sheer size. Honestly, his mass and density and his atomic breath ability are the factors that most aid him in battle. But when you consider some of the monsters from Monster Hunter and their sheer size, coupled with the fact that a lot of them can also emit their own type of dragon fire, so to speak, Godzilla can have some worthy opponents. We recently did a video covering Dalamadur meeting Godzilla and what would happen. The regular Dalamadur from the game would put up an impressive fight against Godzilla, but we think in theory that Godzilla would win. It doesn't mean in every single case he would win. I mean, there are variables to think about, and it also doesn't mean that he would win against every monster. Dalamadur is really huge. And honestly, the bigger or older Dalamadur gets is the more lethal he would be towards Godzilla. Same with Laviente. These creatures just outclassing Godzilla in their length alone is not enough for them to be able to overthrow the kaiju. These two colossal monsters from the Monster Hunter universe are both very similar in how lethal they are. One thing that would make Laviente, the Great Crag Wyvern, a lot more intimidating and probably a lot more lethal towards Godzilla is those tusks that he bears on the front of his face. If the legs of the Mutos can disable Godzilla after a while of Godzilla being overwhelmed, then certainly Laviente ramming his tusks into Godzilla's gills would do some damage, but only for a while, because as we know, Godzilla does have that heightened ability to regenerate. Godzilla's very territorial, he's very aggressive too, but Laviente is voraciously aggressive. Now this is just based on observation and opinion, but it seems as though Laviente would be a more aggressive monster than Dalamadur. Dalamadur seems to be a monster that wants to be left alone and will fight to or by any means necessary to protect itself. Laviente looks like the kind of creature that he will not back down for a fight because he actually likes fighting. He doesn't mind fighting and busting some caps and some cloacas. This monster is so aggressive, it's been likened onto Deviljho, which is one of the most aggressive monsters in the Monster Hunter franchise. Let's talk about reality-wise, though. In Monster Hunter games, you're a little human with the right weapons and the right tactics. You can take down these monsters, but in reality, that probably would not happen unless you had some serious technology and weaponry. Also, in the real world, these monsters would not be sitting still for you for most of the time while you're slashing and hacking them away. I believe that because of their sheer size, if they were to overexert themselves, there would be a period of time when they would be depleted in stamina, similar to what Godzilla has to go through. Creatures who are miles long and so colossal will take a lot of energy just to move. This is the very reason why most of these creatures spend most of their time hibernating. So it's possible that these creatures wouldn't even have anything to do with Godzilla until they come up from hibernation. I think where Godzilla would have a problem is not necessarily with the large monsters, or not even the small monsters. They're not even on the list. But the larger monsters that can fly would be a problem for Godzilla. We see how much of a disadvantage Godzilla is at when fighting flying monsters who are very agile and very powerful and can do attacks from above. It doesn't seem as though elemental attacks would hurt Godzilla because he's so dense and impenetrable. Fire and poison and all that stuff doesn't seem to affect him. He can drop in lava and that would not affect him. I mean, he did have fire coming out of his body. And we do have several monsters in Monster Hunter like that as well. The question is not whether or not their elemental or magical dragon breath would affect him, but whether or not his atomic breath would affect them. We look at creatures like Methuselah from the Monsterverse, and if Godzilla were to rain his atomic breath down on Methuselah, because of Methuselah's armor being even thicker than that of Godzilla's, it is possible that there would be some kaiju or monsters matched in Monster Hunter that would have as thick armor that wouldn't necessarily succumb to Godzilla's atomic attacks. One thing that we know based on what we've seen in the Monsterverse so far is that Godzilla is highly susceptible to physical close-range melee attacks. If a monster can keep ramming him, especially in the gills, it can subdue Godzilla and disable him for a time. The only advantage it would seem that Godzilla has at this point is his ability to quickly regenerate. Godzilla has that ability because of all that energy that he has densely packed inside his body. So no matter how much you beat him down, if he goes and takes a snooze, he'll be okay and possibly even more amped up than he was before, because now he'll really be pissed. The monsters of Monster Hunter so far don't seem to have that, and of course, the game aside. Even if some of them do have that regenerative ability, it's not so quick in comparison to Godzilla's. So they may be able to get the 1-2 punch and win the first 6 rounds, but then later on, Godzilla would just finish them off by depleting their stamina and eventually killing them. Now that's if Godzilla were to fight against these things, and we always just talk about fighting, but how would he function in the Monster Hunter universe? First of all, would the other monsters listen to him? He is an apex predator, but being dropped or teleported into this world, there's sure to be other apex predators that deem themselves as the king of monsters there. They would certainly try to challenge Godzilla, and for a while I imagine, since he's different than all the other monsters there, and he's seen as a bigger threat, the monsters would target him and try to bring him down. He wouldn't have to worry about monsters like Dalamadur and Labiante unless he actually went into their territory or the specific areas where those monsters are. Again, small creatures like Velociprey and Delex and all those others, they wouldn't really care about Godzilla. They'd probably just follow him around to scavenge all the destruction that he'd be leaving in his wake. Creatures like Tigrex would give Godzilla a wide berth, especially those that don't rely on elemental attack. And creatures like Shen Garen would just try to defend themselves out of fear, but possibly those are the things that Godzilla would even feed on or have fun crushing. Eventually, after Godzilla having been there in that universe for a while, the other creatures would soon realize that he is an apex predator and that it's almost impossible to kill him. Now, what would scare you more, to be honest? Something that you can't penetrate, no matter how hard you try, or something that you can subdue, but no matter what you do, it keeps getting up. It refuses to die. That would scare the shit out of me, honestly. Even though the monsters in Monster Hunter seem more primitive, they still have that low-level intelligence to understand when not to mess with something and what not to mess with. Unless it's a monster that can directly rival Godzilla in size, we have to assume that all the other monsters would bow down to Godzilla or at least leave him alone or part like the Red Sea if they see him coming through. That's how the other monsters would react to Godzilla, but how would we react to them? If they left him alone and they decided to be submissive, would he still go around and nom all of them in sight? He's no longer in his world. He no longer has an actual set territory. So how would he establish his territory? What territory would he establish? Would he take it from other monsters? Well, becoming the apex predator in Monster Hunter would be quite easy for him unless the monsters all gang up on him, but he would try to find a territory for himself, or actually try to cover several territories, not just because he wants to, but because he wants to protect himself. If there are bigger and worse monsters out there, he would want to establish where his borders are to discourage those other monsters from challenging him. The other thing that would happen is with all these other kaiju that have elemental attacks as well, because we don't really see this in the monsterverse so far. We're pretty sure there are other monsters out there like Godzilla that have similar elemental attacks, but so far we've seen Godzilla and the Mutos and Ghidorah. Maybe Rodan a little bit with the fireball stuff, but they make it look so weak in the movie. But Ghidorah has those electric attacks and the gravity beams, and Godzilla has his atomic breath. And he can withstand that. No matter what anyone does, he'll get tired, he'll get wounded, and he'll just heal like the freaking Terminator. Then he'll just go nuclear and blast everything. And chances are there are a lot of monsters from the Monster Hunter franchise that don't take kindly to radiation. But what I'm trying to say is that Godzilla would still adapt even further, evolve even further based on his environment. He seems to always change and evolve based on the creatures that he has to fight, or based on how things go down at the last battle that he had with another kaiju. So if he does get bested by Dalamadur, he may go to sleep and regenerate over time, but then he'll come back and actually evolve in a way that is a good match or better than Dalamadur. His anger at losing, and maybe even a little bit of fear that this thing threatens his position, would cause him to bulk up even more. Maybe it's just the way they're also portrayed in Monster Hunter, but based on what we've seen of Godzilla in the Monsterverse, he he does seem to possess a lot more intellect than these creatures. Now, we know that some of these creatures have been around for a long time, but I'm trying to match because it's possible that Dalamadur and other creatures were so ancient that they can predate even dinosaurs and stuff, but based on what we know about Godzilla and Ghidorah, these creatures predate even those. It's all in his behavior, the way that he's able to look and observe and calculate what his enemy is doing. The other monsters from Monster Hunter just seem to attack. Of course, they do possess intellect, but it doesn't seem as though they're as intellectual as Godzilla, where it comes to backing off and watching what their prey is doing. They just seem to react in defense of being attacked or when they're hunting. The creatures in Monster Hunter are nerfed for the game so that you can actually defeat them, but Godzilla himself is also nerfed in the Monsterverse. Godzilla and these monsters would fight a lot more brutally if things were to happen without us requiring dramatic tension. So to reiterate and conclude, the only thing that Godzilla would have working against him in this world is size. Size matters, and if there are bigger creatures, a bigger Dalamadur, a bigger creature in general, they can best Godzilla. It would be hard to kill him, but he could be killed if something were big enough and forceful enough to do damage. Godzilla does have extreme regenerative properties, but I think it's only to a point. If something's foot is as big as Godzilla and it steps on Godzilla, he's dead. Blood, guts, viscera is going to be going spewing from every part of his body. But from what we know about Godzilla and the monsters in Monster Hunter so far, he would try to show them who's boss. He would get a few of them to listen, and he would cap a few of them until he finds something that's bigger and badder than he is. When you look at it, the two universes are not that different. Monster Hunter really is just Monsterverse with different kaiju. So if Godzilla were to be teleported there, yes, he'd be disoriented, but if he were to live there for the rest of his life, it wouldn't be that much different than how it is now. I guess the only thing that would be great about it is that, well, there are no humans, even though he does benefit off the humans because of the radiation stuff. But even so, he'd find a way to adapt with that because he did exist around the time of the dinosaurs as well, and he did just fine. That's just our theory. What do you guys would think if Godzilla was suddenly teleported to the Monster Hunter universe? Do you think he'd be at home there because he's a kaiju and he's the biggest and baddest of most of them? Or do you think that there is something that can easily dethrone Godzilla? Let us know in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. This has been Ultiori. You ask, we answer.